Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and talk about the Samsung Galaxy S20 and see how this phone holds up in 2023. Now, one thing I will definitely tell you is I think this phone is probably still one of my favorite phones ever made from Samsung. I think it was a pretty big difference from the Galaxy S10, which was, in fact, a really big difference from its predecessor. So the fact that this phone was able to hold up that well, it's actually quite fascinating to me. And even now, it still holds up extremely well in my opinion. So if you want to pick up this phone or some other phones I would recommend buying, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Galaxy S20, this phone, I think, is still a beautiful looking phone. And it's crazy to me just kind of thinking about like the future and thinking about the Samsung Galaxy S20. How could Samsung make a phone that looks better than this thing? I mean, it's almost like impossible if I kind of think about it. This phone on the front had a 6.2-inch dynamic AMOLED display, and it was a 120Hz panel at 1440p. Samsung now doesn't even make those types of screens for their base model like smaller, Samsung phones. They still make, 120Hz panels, but they are no longer 1440p. Obviously the Ultras do have those panels, but like I mentioned, having that type of capability on this phone is very insane to me. In fact, I think this panel looks probably better in some ways than the Galaxy S22 does right now. Although the S22 does get brighter and whatnot, the S20 still has a very, very good sharp panel. And it does have a curved panel as well. So because of that, like I said before, it gives the impression that it is a little bit more bezel-less than it actually is. Now on top of that, we do have the microSD card slot on this phone as well, which that in and of itself is insane. Again, having that type of capability of just plugging in storage like that is so awesome, and that in and of itself is still one of my favorite things about the Samsung phone. It was one of the last Samsung Galaxy S phones to actually have that. Now I think all the phones don't have it anymore, which is very, very sad, but this phone did have it, which was beautiful in my opinion. Now on top of that, we do have the USB-C port on the bottom, and again, that is another really cool thing that we have. Having Samsung DeX and using that USB-C port is cool. I think we take it for granted how awesome that feature is in my opinion. But on the back, this was one of the more interesting choices from Samsung. Now it does have that glass back, which is nice. It has a triple camera setup back there too. It has wireless charging, reverse wireless charging, IP certification, the whole 9 yards. But the problem with the back is it just wasn't that good looking. Every time I would look at the front of this phone, probably one of the best looking phones on the front. But when I looked at it on the back, it just did not look like a good phone at all. It looked like some old outdated phone that you would see I don't even know, it's just such a weird looking phone in the back. And I don't know why Samsung went this approach. Since then, the back of their phones have gotten significantly better looking. Even though the Galaxy S21 had a plastic back, it still looked much better than the Galaxy S20. So that's kind of the only downside of the hardware on the outside of this phone. Otherwise though, I still think this phone looks very, very good. I think the screen is still very sharp, and overall the outside, other than the back, I don't really have too many complaints about it. Now in terms of the camera setup, this was another pretty big advantage and another update that Samsung gave on this specific phone. We had a 12 megapixel wide angle camera on the back, a 64 megapixel telephoto lens, and a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, and on the front we had a 10 megapixel wide angle lens. Now like I mentioned, this was probably the big update with this specific phone. When I saw this phone, a lot of people were mentioning this camera, and the reason for that was because of that 8K capability on the back. Funny enough, I think since then there's not really been too many people who've talked about it, but the 8K capability in and of itself is an amazing feature. You have, first of all, the zooming in and zooming out capability, which this phone can zoom in and zoom out quite a bit. Having that type of capability, again, of zooming in a lot and zooming out a lot, is a very cool feature, and that's why I always prefer phones that have that triple camera setup, because it just kind of future-proofs yourself for a while. This phone is approaching 3 years old, and it's still a pretty modern phone because of that camera. Imagine if they only put a dual camera setup in there, right? Probably wouldn't be the same. Now, I will say the other thing about this camera, tons of features built in. There are lots and lots of features built into this camera that even though it doesn't have the most amount of capability of all time, it still has a lot of features built in, which that in and of itself is a really nice touch. I will say though, the only downside I can think of, for one, again, if you're using apps like Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, they're not really going to be the most up to date, and they're not really going to be, they're not going to be one-to-one in terms of how much they pair up. The quality is not going to be perfect, but it's still going to be okay. On top of that, if you're trying to, go through the stock camera app, it can seem a little glitchy at times, but otherwise, I think it's a very good camera still. The only other thing I can think of though for the software and longevity standpoint is that this phone is probably on one of its last versions of software. I think it's probably going to maybe get another version of One UI if my numbers are correct. And I'm really hoping that's the case because I truly do feel like this phone could last for a very long amount of time. I feel like I said before, Samsung did such a great job with this phone that this phone could theoretically last forever. And if they can just go ahead and just keep supporting this phone, that would be awesome. Again, I don't think they are. But with the current One UI 5 update though, my phone still has not gotten it. And that is kind of one of the downsides here. Pretty much a lot of other people's Samsung Galaxy S20s, S21s, S22s have already gotten the update. My S22 got the update, but my S21 and the Galaxy S20 still have not gotten the update yet, which is a huge downside. I want to experience all those One UI 5 updates on my S20, and I can't yet. And that's kind of one of the downsides of using at least an older Samsung phone, is because it just seems like you have to wait for the carrier. And in my case, I have an unlocked Samsung, so I don't even know what's going on here. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens, but I just wish Samsung would push out the updates at the same time for all the Samsung phones, like how Apple does with their, iPhones, like how Google does with their Pixels. I don't know why Samsung doesn't already do that, but in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now in the performance segment, this phone had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 chipset inside of it with 8GB of RAM. There's only ever one model of this phone too, that 8GB of RAM option, and I think this phone's performance is still very, very good and very decent for what you're getting. So this is what I'll break it down with you for. Basically, whenever I'm using a lot of phones on my second channel or third channel, I'm primarily using any phone that I have at my availability. Usually it's like a year or 2 year old phone at that point, if it's not the latest one. And the Samsung Galaxy S20 is one of those phones I use quite a bit when I'm trying to demonstrate certain Android features or certain Android updates or whatever the case is. And one thing about the Galaxy S20 is it's always been dependable, it's always been fast, and I think the performance of this phone is still pretty good. The only downsides I ever really remember is, maybe its glitchiness. Sometimes if you try to use the gestures and you try to swipe out of an app, it can kind of be a little bit kind of annoying because sometimes it'll kind of stay on the same app, or it'll show me the gesture bar but it won't actually close out of the application. Another thing, sometimes if you actually go through, but other than that, there's not really been a lot of other crazy things. Sometimes the screen is a little bit oversensitive in my opinion, but otherwise I still think it's a very, very good performing phone. Again, it's probably not going to be beating your 888 chipset or your Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 or 8 Gen Plus Gen 1, whatever that one's called on that Z Fold 4 and Z Flip 4, but I still think it's a pretty good, I think it's a good performing phone. If you're wanting to just, use the basic apps, or if you want to take it up a notch and play games like Genshin Impact on fairly high graphics, it's definitely going to be good. Like I said, it's not going to be perfect, but from a lot of things that I've tested, it seems okay. So from the performance segment, I still think it's pretty good. And the battery life, this thing had a 4,000 mAh battery inside of it, which is insane. That is a really big size battery to have on a phone like this as well. And although it's not perfect anymore, I still think it's pretty good for how old this phone is now. So overall, what I'll tell you is I think the Samsung Galaxy S20 is still a pretty good phone overall. I think it has a lot of capabilities, still has a lot of life left in it. And even if this phone ends on One UI 5, I still think you can use this phone for another year or two and still get a lot of life out of it. Maybe even longer than that if Samsung supports it another year. So I think this phone is still very good. If you have it, I would recommend keeping it. You're not really missing out too much stuff from the S22, but I am curious to see how the S23 stacks up against this phone, and we'll just kind of keep an eye on it, but I still think this phone is still completely worth it for sure. So in terms of that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that means so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.